Jake Whitehorse lowered his camera, the telephoto lens trembling in his weathered hands as he stared at the massive form beside the dried creek bed. The grizzly bear lay motionless, dark fur matted with something that wasn't water, breathing so shallow it barely moved the morning mist. This wasn't right. Bears didn't just lie there when humans approached. Margaret Clearwater's gasp echoed through the radio static as Jake's footage reached the Wildlife Center. "Sweet Lord in heaven," she whispered, her 73-year-old voice cracking. "What's that moving underneath him?" Jake's military training kicked in as he noticed the bear's positioning, protective, deliberate, like a soldier shielding something precious. The massive creature's scarred face turned toward him, revealing an X-shaped brand burned deep into the fur, eyes holding an intelligence that made Jake's stomach drop. "Get Doctor Riverwind out here now," he commanded into the radio, his own voice betraying the tremor he thought he'd left in Afghanistan. What kind of horror had created those scars? And what was this broken giant protecting with his dying breath? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Shasta Wildlife Rehabilitation Center sat nestled against the pine-covered foothills like a fortress of hope in an increasingly harsh world. Dr. Sarah Riverwind had built this sanctuary with her own calloused hands and her father's war pension, every weathered board and reinforced fence a testament to the belief that some things in this world still deserved protection. At 52, Sarah carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades coaxing trust from creatures that had every reason to fear humans. Her graying black hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hands bore the scars of countless rescues, teeth marks, claw scratches, and chemical burns from cleaning infected wounds. She'd inherited more than just her father's Cherokee features. She'd inherited his unwavering conviction that those who can fight must protect those who cannot. But the stack of unpaid bills on her desk told a different story than her determined facade. The center owed $200,000 to creditors, and the bank had given her 48 hours to produce a miracle or lose everything. Every morning, she counted the remaining bags of animal feed like a general rationing supplies before a siege. Margaret Clearwater had become Sarah's unlikely anchor in these troubled waters. The 73-year-old widow arrived each morning at 6 sharp, her silver hair perfectly curled despite the early hour, carrying homemade biscuits and an inexhaustible supply of grandmother's wisdom. Margaret lived on $200 a month in Social Security, but somehow always found $20 to slip into the donation jar when she thought no one was looking. "You know what I miss most about being young?" Margaret would say while feeding the orphaned fawns. "Thinking I had time to waste on worry. These babies don't care about our money troubles. They just need love and formula." Her 3 adult children lived scattered across the country, too busy building their own lives to visit, but the animals at the center had become her surrogate grandchildren. Jake Whitehorse represented the walking wounded who found their way to Sarah's door. The 45-year-old war photographer carried Afghanistan in his shoulders, always slightly hunched, as if still bracing for incoming fire. His Lakota grandfather's teachings about respecting all living things had drawn him to wildlife photography, but the steady income came from his disability pension. Most nights he slept in his truck in the center's parking lot, claiming he preferred the stars to walls, though Sarah suspected it was really about the nightmares. Jake's camera had captured some of the most haunting images of war, but these days he focused on gentler subjects: bears teaching cubs to fish, eagles soaring against mountain backdrops, moments of pure beauty in a world that seemed increasingly ugly. His photographs brought in donations and awareness, but never quite enough to keep the center afloat. This morning's radio call from Jake carried an urgency that made Sarah's hands shake as she grabbed her emergency kit. In 25 years of wildlife rescue, She'd learned to recognize the difference between a routine call and something that would change everything. The emergency response team's arrival shattered the morning silence like thunder across the mountains. Sarah's beaten Ford pickup truck lurched to a stop beside Jake's position, followed by Margaret in her pristine 1987 Buick that she drove exactly 5 miles under the speed limit everywhere except wildlife emergencies. The two volunteers who'd answered the call, college students from UC Davis earning field credits, tumbled out with wide eyes and shaking hands. Jake hadn't moved from his crouch 30 feet from the bear, his camera now forgotten at his side. "Doc, I've been watching him for 40 minutes, he whispered, as Sarah approached with her tranquilizer kit. "He's protecting something underneath him. Won't let me get closer, but he's not aggressive either. It's like he's asking for help." Sarah had seen thousands of injured animals, but the sight of this massive grizzly stopped her cold. The bear had to weigh over 400 pounds, his dark fur scarred by what looked like deliberate burns and cuts. The X-shaped brand on his face was deep and old, the kind of marking that spoke of human cruelty beyond imagination. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch, intelligent, pleading, and filled with a desperation she'd only seen in parents protecting their young. "Margaret, keep the students back," Sarah ordered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Jake, if I approach from the left, can you cover me from that boulder?" The bear's massive head tracked their movements, but he didn't growl or bare his teeth. Instead, he shifted slightly, and that's when they all heard it, a weak, mewling cry from beneath his body. "Sweet Jesus," Margaret breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "There's babies under there." Sarah's veterinary training kicked in as she moved closer, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Easy, big guy. I know you're scared. I know you're protecting them. Let me help." The bear's breathing was labored, his flanks heaving with exhaustion. Dark stains in the dirt around him weren't just from the creek. This magnificent creature was bleeding from multiple wounds. When Sarah got within 10 feet, the bear made a sound she'd never heard before. Not a growl or roar, but something almost like a whimper. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his massive foreleg. Underneath, pressed against his belly for warmth, were 2 tiny bear cubs. The sight hit the team like a physical blow. The cubs couldn't have been more than 4 months old, their fur matted and dirty, their breathing rapid and shallow. One was slightly larger, a female with distinctive white markings on her chest. The smaller one, clearly male, was barely moving. "They're dying," Sarah whispered, dropping to her knees. "Severe dehydration, possible starvation. They've got maybe 6 hours before organ failure." Margaret had seen her share of suffering in 7 decades of life, but the sight of this massive bear sacrificing himself to keep 2 babies warm broke something open in her chest. "He's been sharing his water with them," she said, pointing to the damp fur around the cubs' mouths. "Look at him. He's skin and bones under all that fur. He's been starving himself to keep them alive." Jake moved closer, his photographer's eye cataloging details that made his stomach turn. "These cubs aren't his," he said quietly. "Wrong age, wrong subspecies. Someone taught him to care for them." The implications hung heavy in the mountain air. This wasn't natural behavior. Male grizzlies typically killed cubs that weren't their own. Someone had trained this bear, scarred him, and somehow he'd ended up as the unlikely guardian of 2 orphans. Sarah made the decision that would change everything. "We're taking them all," she announced, her voice cutting through the morning silence like a blade. "I don't care about protocol. I don't care about regulations. This family isn't getting separated on my watch." The college students exchanged nervous glances. "Dr. Riverwind," one ventured, "the guidelines clearly state." "The guidelines," Margaret interrupted with the authority of someone who'd survived the Vietnam War, raised 3 children alone, and buried a husband, "can kiss my wrinkled behind. Sometimes love matters more than rules." The bear seemed to understand their intention. As Sarah prepared the emergency medical supplies, he shifted again, carefully exposing the cubs while keeping himself between them and the humans. It was an act of trust that spoke volumes about both his intelligence and his desperation. "Jake, I need you to radio ahead," Sarah commanded, her hands already moving to examine the cubs. "Tell them we're bringing in a grizzly with 2 cubs, emergency status. And Jake?" She looked up, her eyes blazing with determination. "Tell them we're about to break every rule in the book, and I don't give a damn who has a problem with that." The morning sun climbed higher over the Shasta Peaks as an unlikely family prepared for the fight of their lives. The Wildlife Center's emergency bay erupted into controlled chaos as the rescue convoy pulled through the gates. Sarah had radioed ahead with updates that sent her small staff into overdrive, preparing the largest enclosure, mixing emergency formula, and setting up IV equipment for what promised to be the most challenging case in the center's 25-year history. The bear, whom Margaret had started calling Marcus after her late grandfather, had allowed them to load him and the cubs into the modified horse trailer with surprising cooperation. But his condition was worse than they'd initially realized. The X-shaped scar on his face was just the most visible mark of systematic abuse. His body told a horrific story of deliberate cruelty that made even Sarah's experienced team sick to their stomachs. "Whoever did this to him broke nearly every bone in his right paw," Sarah murmured as she completed her initial examination, her hands gentle despite her growing rage. "These burns are from heated metal, probably brands or pokers. And look here." She pointed to perfectly spaced scars along his back legs. "These are from electric prods. Someone trained him to endure pain." Jake stood guard beside the enclosure, his military bearing rigid with barely contained fury. He'd seen torture before, in places where human dignity meant nothing, but seeing it inflicted on an innocent animal triggered something primal in his chest. "How long do you think he was held?" he asked, his voice tight. "Based on the healing patterns?" "Years," Sarah replied, her professional composure cracking slightly. This wasn't just abuse. This was systematic conditioning. Someone wanted him broken but functional. The cubs presented their own heartbreaking mystery. Luna, the female, responded well to initial treatment, her natural curiosity and playfulness emerging as IV fluids restored her strength. But Bear Jr., the smaller male, remained listless and withdrawn, refusing bottle feeding despite obvious hunger. Margaret had claimed feeding duty, her grandmother's instincts taking over completely. "Come on, baby boy," she cooed, settling into the rocking chair she'd dragged from her own living room. "Your mama can't feed you right now, but this old lady's got plenty of love to spare." She'd been bottle feeding premature lambs since she was 12. Orphaned bear cubs weren't so different. It was during Luna's first successful feeding that they discovered the microchip. Sarah's scanner beeped insistently as she checked the female cub for injuries. "That's impossible," she muttered, checking the readout twice. "This says she's registered to Aurora, a breeding female reported stolen 18 months ago from the Cascade Mountain facility." The implications hit the room like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just a rescue, it was potentially a federal case involving interstate wildlife trafficking. But more importantly, it meant these cubs had a mother somewhere, possibly still alive. Jake was researching the Cascade facility on his laptop when a black SUV pulled into the center's parking lot. Through the window, they watched a well-dressed man in his late 40s emerge, speaking rapidly into a satellite phone. Everything about him screamed government or corporate. Too clean, too expensive for the rural mountain setting. "Vincent Stormcloud," he announced himself at the front desk, flashing credentials that identified him as a wildlife recovery specialist. "I understand you've recovered some animals that belong to my client's operation." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. Something about this man's too perfect smile and predatory eyes reminded her of the politicians who'd promised her father's veteran benefits would never be cut. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Stormcloud." "Dr. Riverwind, let's not play games," Vincent replied smoothly, producing official-looking paperwork from his briefcase. "The bear you recovered this morning is registered property of Wilderness Entertainment, LLC. The cubs are offspring of Aurora, also registered to our facility. We're here to reclaim our assets." Margaret stepped forward, all 73 years of accumulated righteous indignation blazing in her eyes. "Assets?" she repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. "That asset in there nearly died keeping those babies alive. Any fool can see they're a family, legal papers or not." Vincent's mask slipped slightly, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Ma'am, with all due respect, the law doesn't recognize emotional attachments in livestock management. These animals represent a significant financial investment." "Financial investment," Jake repeated flatly, his photographer's eye cataloging the expensive watch on Vincent's wrist, the manicured nails, the shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. What kind of business requires branding bears with an X? For a split second, Vincent's composure cracked completely. Sarah caught the flash of recognition, quickly suppressed, and realized this man knew exactly what Marcus had endured. Worse, he'd probably ordered it. "I think you should leave," Sarah said, her voice deadly quiet. "These animals are under medical care. They're not going anywhere until they're healthy." Vincent's smile returned, but it never reached his eyes. "Dr. Riverwind, I understand you're facing some financial difficulties. The bank is foreclosing on this facility in," he checked his expensive watch, "36 hours. Perhaps we could discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement." The room fell silent, except for the hum of medical equipment and the distant sound of Marcus gently rumbling to his cubs. Sarah felt the walls of her life's work closing in around her. $200,000 might as well have been $2 million. There was no way to raise that kind of money in 36 hours. "How much?" she asked, hating herself for even considering it. $100,000 for the bear," Vincent said, his confidence returning. $50,000 for each cub, cash, transferred today. Enough to save your little sanctuary and help a lot more animals. Margaret made a sound like a wounded animal. "You're talking about selling them back to the people who tortured them." "I'm talking about business, ma'am. Sometimes personal feelings have to take a back seat to practical realities." Jake stepped closer to Vincent, his military training evident in every controlled movement. "And sometimes practical realities include the fact that bear fighting is a federal crime, transporting animals across state lines for illegal purposes, conspiracy to commit animal cruelty." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I wonder what the FBI would find if they looked real close at Wilderness Entertainment, LLC. Vincent's facade finally shattered completely, revealing the dangerous man underneath. "Mr. Whitehorse, I'd be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. Men in your condition sometimes have trouble distinguishing reality from paranoid delusions." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a forest fire, acrid and poisonous. Sarah realized they weren't just dealing with an animal trafficker. They were dealing with someone who'd researched them, knew their vulnerabilities, and wasn't afraid to exploit them. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the Shasta Peaks, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Vincent Stormcloud's arrival was just the beginning of a much larger tempest headed their way. The hours after Vincent's departure felt like waiting for an earthquake everyone knew was coming. Sarah found herself checking the locks on the animal enclosures obsessively, while Jake had positioned himself in the parking lot with a clear view of all access roads. Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, stress baking enough cookies to feed an army, her way of processing the terror that had walked through their door wearing an expensive suit. Marcus seemed to sense the tension rippling through his human protectors. The massive bear paced restlessly in his enclosure, never straying more than a few feet from where Luna and Bear Jr. slept in their heated recovery box. His scarred face constantly turned toward the main building, as if he could smell danger approaching on the mountain wind. "He knows," Jake observed during his evening watch, speaking quietly to Sarah through the radio. Animals always know when predators are circling. The first breakthrough came at midnight when Bear Jr. finally accepted a full bottle from Margaret. The elderly woman had been taking 2-hour shifts around the clock, her patience finally rewarded when the tiny cub's survival instincts overcame his trauma. "That's my boy," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as the cub's tiny paws kneaded against her forearm. "You fight, baby. You fight for all of us." Sarah documented the feeding success in Marcus's medical chart, but her hands shook as she wrote. Every hour that passed brought them closer to the bank's deadline, and Vincent's offer haunted her thoughts like a fever dream. $150,000 would save the center, protect all the other animals in their care, fund years of rescues, but it would doom Marcus and his cubs to lives of torture and exploitation. Jake found her crying in the medical supply room at 3 in the morning, surrounded by empty donation boxes and past-due invoices. "I keep thinking about all the animals we could save with that money," she confessed, her voice breaking. "Hundreds of creatures who need our help. How do I choose 3 lives over hundreds?" Jake sat beside her on the concrete floor, his own demons stirring in the darkness. "In Afghanistan, they used to give us these impossible choices all the time. Save the village or save the platoon. Save the intel or save the informant's family. You know what I learned?" He paused, staring at his calloused hands. "The moment you start measuring love in numbers, you've already lost your soul." Meanwhile, Margaret was conducting her own investigation. 73 years of life had taught her that men like Vincent Stormcloud always left trails of damage in their wake. She spent the pre-dawn hours on her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard with surprising speed for someone her age. "Sarah, honey, you need to see this," she called as the sun crested the mountains. Her laptop screen displayed newspaper archives dating back 20 years. "Vincent Stormcloud has been involved in 3 different wildlife facilities that were shut down for animal cruelty. Each time, he disappeared before authorities could build a case." The pattern was sickeningly clear. Vincent would establish seemingly legitimate breeding operations, then gradually transition into underground entertainment. Bear fighting, illegal hunting preserves, exotic animal trafficking. He was a one-man epidemic of cruelty wrapped in legal paperwork and corporate protections. "Look at this," Margaret continued, her grandmother's intuition proving sharper than any federal investigation. "He's always worked with partners. Military contractors, government officials, people with security clearances. That's how he stays ahead of the law." Sarah studied the articles with growing horror. Photos showed facilities that looked exactly like legitimate wildlife centers until you noticed the fighting rings hidden in back buildings, the modified transport vehicles designed for terrified animals, the customers who paid premium prices to watch creatures tear each other apart. "My God," she whispered, "how many animals has he destroyed?" The answer came sooner than expected. Jake's radio crackled to life at 7:30, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Doc, you need to get out here. We've got company." 3 black SUVs had surrounded the center's entrance, effectively blocking any vehicle from leaving. Vincent emerged from the lead car with 4 men who looked like private military contractors, crew cuts, tactical gear, and the kind of professional stillness that spoke of violence held in careful check. But it was the woman who stepped out of the second vehicle that made Sarah's blood run cold. Dr. Elena Vasquez, state wildlife inspector, carried a briefcase full of official seals and the authority to shut down any facility she deemed non-compliant with federal standards. "Dr. Riverwind," Vincent called across the parking lot, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who held all the cards. "I believe you know Dr. Vasquez. She's here to conduct an emergency inspection of your facility." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. Emergency inspections were supposed to be random, unannounced, and conducted by neutral parties. Having Vincent present meant the fix was already in. Dr. Vasquez was thorough and merciless. She found expired medications that had been used successfully for years, criticized enclosure sizes that exceeded federal minimums, and questioned every decision Sarah had made regarding Marcus and the cubs. "This bear should have been immediately transferred to a federal facility," she declared, making notes on her tablet. "Keeping him here without proper authorization violates at least 6 different wildlife protection statutes." Margaret stepped forward, her elderly frame somehow radiating the authority of someone who'd survived 7 decades of watching bureaucrats destroy everything good in the world. "And I suppose Mr. Stormcloud's facility has proper authorization?" Dr. Vasquez didn't even have the grace to look embarrassed. "Wilderness Entertainment LLC maintains all required permits for large predator housing and breeding programs." "Breeding programs," Jake repeated, his photographer's instincts capturing the exchange on his phone camera. "Is that what you call bear fighting now?" Vincent's contractors shifted slightly, hands moving closer to concealed weapons. Sarah realized they were moments away from a confrontation that would end with someone getting hurt and Marcus being dragged away in chains. That's when the miracle happened. Cars began arriving in the center's parking lot, not the official vehicles they'd been dreading, but pickup trucks and minivans driven by people Sarah barely recognized. Word had spread through the small mountain community overnight, carried by social media posts of Jake's photographs and Margaret's passionate Facebook plea for help. Tom Anderson, who ran the local hardware store, pulled up in his ancient Chevy with a bed full of building supplies. "Heard you might need some fence repairs," he said, completely ignoring the armed men surrounding the property. Betty Chen, from the diner, arrived with enough food to feed an army, her teenage daughter filming everything on her phone. "Someone's got to make sure everyone stays fed during this inspection." More vehicles kept coming. Retired teachers, Forest Service workers, Native American Tribal Council members, even some tourists who'd seen the story on morning news programs. None of them said much, but they formed a human barrier between Vincent's people and the animal enclosures. Margaret stood in the center of it all, tears streaming down her face as the community she'd lived in for 50 years rallied around their makeshift family. "You see that?" she whispered to Sarah. "That's what happens when good people decide they've had enough of bullies." But Vincent wasn't finished. As Dr. Vasquez completed her inspection, finding enough technical violations to justify a shutdown, he played his final card. "I'm prepared to make one final offer," he announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. $200,000 for the bear and cubs. Cash today. That's enough to pay off all debts, expand the facility, and help many more animals." The crowd fell silent. Even Sarah's strongest supporters understood the brutal mathematics of the situation. $200,000 could save countless animals over the years, fund programs that didn't exist, provide medical care for creatures that would otherwise suffer. Sarah looked at Marcus through the chain-link fence. The scarred bear was watching the human drama unfold with those intelligent eyes, his massive body positioned protectively between the crowd and his cubs. In that moment, she saw her father's face in her memory, heard his voice saying the words that had shaped her entire life. "Character isn't what you do when it's easy, Sarah. Character is what you do when it costs you everything." "Mr. Stormcloud," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the parking lot, "I have a counteroffer for you." Vincent's eyebrows raised slightly. "I'm listening." Sarah stepped forward, flanked by Margaret and Jake, backed by a community that had chosen love over fear. "Get off my property right now, before I call every news station in California and tell them exactly what kind of business you're really running." Vincent's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the predator underneath. "You're making a mistake, Dr. Riverwind. A very expensive mistake." "Maybe," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the terror in her chest. "But it's my mistake to make. And sometimes the most expensive choices are the only ones worth making." As Vincent and his people loaded back into their vehicles, Margaret squeezed Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "Your daddy would be proud," she whispered. "Standing up to bullies never gets easier, but it always gets more important." But even as the crowd cheered and the immediate threat retreated, Sarah knew this wasn't over. Vincent Stormcloud wasn't the type of man who accepted defeat gracefully. He'd be back, and next time he'd bring more than paperwork and intimidation. The real fight was just beginning. The community support that had felt like salvation in the daylight took on a more ominous weight as darkness fell over the Shasta Mountains. Sarah stood at her office window, watching Jake patrol the perimeter with military precision while volunteers maintained a vigil around Marcus's enclosure. The sight should have been comforting, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were all sitting targets in Vincent's crosshairs. Margaret had transformed the center's kitchen into a command post, coordinating shifts of volunteers while simultaneously researching everything she could find about Wilderness Entertainment, LLC. Her laptop screen glowed in the darkness as she followed digital breadcrumbs that led deeper into a world of corporate shell companies and offshore accounts. "Sarah, honey, come look at this," Margaret called, her voice tight with discovery. "I've found something that's going to make your blood boil." The documents Margaret had uncovered painted a picture of systematic corruption that stretched back decades. Wilderness Entertainment wasn't just Vincent's company. It was part of a network of facilities operating across the western United States, all connected through a web of shared investors and rotating management. "Look at these names," Margaret said, pointing to a list of board members and financial backers. "Judge Harold Winters, who's been dismissing animal cruelty cases for 15 years. Senator Patricia Kane, who's blocked every piece of wildlife protection legislation that's come across her desk. And this one here." Sarah's breath caught as she read the name at the bottom of the investor list. Colonel James Riverwind, retired. Her father's name in black and white, connected to the very organization that had tortured Marcus. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, her hands shaking as she stared at the screen. "My father spent his entire life protecting animals. He would never—" "Keep reading," Margaret said gently, her grandmother's intuition recognizing the signs of a world about to shatter. The documents told a story Sarah had never imagined. Her father hadn't been an investor in Vincent's operation. He'd been investigating it. The files contained copies of his military intelligence reports, photographs of illegal facilities, and detailed records of animal trafficking operations he'd been tracking for the FBI. Colonel James Riverwind had died 15 years ago, officially of a heart attack while hiking alone in the mountains, but the documents suggested a different truth. He'd been getting close to exposing the entire network when his investigation was suddenly terminated, and he was found dead on a trail he'd hiked hundreds of times without incident. "They killed him," Sarah said, the words falling from her lips like stones. "Vincent and his people killed my father." Margaret's weathered hand found Sarah's shoulder, offering comfort born of a lifetime of watching good people pay the price for standing up to evil. "Your daddy was a hero, honey. He died protecting creatures that couldn't protect themselves, just like you're doing now." The revelation explained so much about Sarah's childhood: her father's sudden mood changes, the late-night phone calls, the way he'd trained her to use weapons and watch for strangers. He'd known he was in danger, had been preparing her to carry on his work if something happened to him. Jake's voice crackled through the radio, interrupting Sarah's spiral into grief and rage. "Doc, we've got movement on the access road. 3 vehicles, no headlights, approaching from the east." The attack came at 2 in the morning, when human alertness naturally flagged and even the most dedicated volunteers struggled to stay awake. Vincent's people moved like the professionals they were, using night vision and military tactics to neutralize the volunteer perimeter guards without violence, tranquilizer darts that left people unconscious but alive. Sarah woke to Margaret shaking her shoulder, the elderly woman's face pale with terror. "They're inside the compound," Margaret whispered. "Jake's trying to hold them off, but there's too many." Through her office window, Sarah could see figures in tactical gear moving purposefully toward Marcus's enclosure. The bear was on his feet, his massive frame tense with protective fury as armed men approached his cubs. Even from a distance, Sarah could hear his deep, rumbling growl, a sound that spoke of a creature pushed beyond its limits. "They're going to tranquilize him," Sarah realized, grabbing her emergency veterinary kit. In his condition, with that much sedative, it could kill him. Margaret's hand closed around Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. "You go out there, they'll take you too. Then who's going to protect those babies?" The standoff at Marcus's enclosure played out like a nightmare in slow motion. Vincent stood just outside the fence, directing his men with calm precision, while Marcus paced frantically inside, his attention split between the human threat and the cubs cowering behind him. "Easy money, big guy," Vincent called out, his voice carrying a casual cruelty that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Just like old times. You remember how this works? You fight, you eat, you don't fight. The little ones suffer." Marcus's response was a roar that shook the mountain air, a sound of pure rage and defiance that spoke volumes about what this magnificent creature had endured. But Sarah could see the terrible calculation in his scarred face. He knew he couldn't win against armed humans, but he'd die before letting them take his cubs. Jake's military training kicked in as he flanked Vincent's position, using the center's buildings for cover as he worked his way closer to the enclosure. His radio whispered through the darkness, "Doc, when I give the signal, hit the emergency floodlights. Blind them for 30 seconds." But Vincent had anticipated resistance. One of his contractors spotted Jake's movement and fired a tranquilizer dart that dropped the war photographer instantly. Sarah watched in horror as Jake crumpled to the ground, his body convulsing slightly before going still. "Now, Dr. Riverwind," Vincent called out, his voice carrying clearly across the compound. "You can end this peacefully. Open the enclosure. Let us collect our property, and no one else gets hurt." Sarah stepped out of the building, her hands raised but her mind racing. In the enclosure, Marcus had gone completely still, his intelligent eyes fixed on the humans who held his fate in their hands. The cubs huddled against his massive legs, their tiny forms trembling with terror. "My father was getting close, wasn't he?" Sarah said, her voice carrying across the night air. "That's why you killed him. He was about to expose everything." Vincent's momentary pause told her everything she needed to know. "Your father was a good soldier who got in over his head. Some battles aren't meant to be won." Margaret's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "And some old ladies are tougher than they look." The 73-year-old woman stepped into view carrying Sarah's father's old hunting rifle, her hands steady despite her age. "I've been shooting predators off this mountain for 50 years, Mr. Stormcloud. You're just another varmint that needs removing." The contractor nearest to Margaret swung his weapon toward her, but Marcus chose that moment to act. The massive bear slammed his full weight against the enclosure fence, bending the chain link outward with a screech of tortured metal. The sound distracted the gunman for a split second, long enough for Margaret to prove that her aim was still true. The tranquilizer dart took the contractor in the shoulder, dropping him immediately. Margaret was already working the rifle's bolt action, her movements swift and sure. "Anyone else want to try an old woman?" she called out, her voice ringing with the authority of someone who'd faced down worse threats than hired thugs. Vincent's remaining men found themselves caught between a protective bear, an armed grandmother, and a veterinarian who'd inherited her father's tactical training. The standoff stretched through the longest minutes of Sarah's life, broken only by the distant sound of sirens approaching through the mountain darkness. Jake's emergency call had gone through before he was tranquilized, bringing both the county sheriff and FBI agents who'd been investigating wilderness entertainment for months. Vincent's operation finally collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. Years of evidence gathering culminating in arrests that would dismantle the entire network. But the victory felt hollow as paramedics worked over Jake's unconscious form, and Sarah knelt beside Marcus's enclosure. The massive bear had exhausted himself in the confrontation, his breathing labored and irregular. The stress of protecting his cubs had pushed his already damaged body beyond its limits. "Hold on, big guy," Sarah whispered through the fence. "Just hold on a little longer." Marcus turned his scarred face toward her voice, those intelligent eyes holding a depth of gratitude that transcended species. He'd fought his last battle, protected his cubs from the monsters that had created him, and found humans worthy of trust in his final moments. As dawn broke over the Shasta Mountains, Sarah realized that some victories came at a price that made them feel like defeats. The veterinary emergency room at the Wildlife Center had never seen anything like the desperate fight for Marcus's life that unfolded in the pre-dawn hours. Sarah worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that losing this battle meant losing everything the scarred bear had sacrificed to protect. His massive body lay unconscious on the reinforced surgical table, every breath a labored struggle against systems that were shutting down one by one. "His heart rate's dropping," announced Dr. Patricia Yamamoto, the emergency veterinarian who'd driven through the night from Sacramento. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she monitored the equipment keeping Marcus alive. The stress from the confrontation triggered massive organ failure. "His kidneys are barely functioning." Margaret stood vigil beside the surgical table, her weathered hands gently stroking Marcus's scarred forehead while she whispered the same lullabies she'd sung to her own children decades ago. At 73, she'd buried a husband, watched friends succumb to age and illness, but nothing had prepared her for the possibility of losing this gentle giant who'd taught them all what courage looked like. "Come on, baby," she murmured, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Those little ones need their daddy. You can't leave them now, not after everything you've done." In the adjacent recovery room, Luna and Bear Jr. seemed to sense their protector's distress. The cubs huddled together in their heated enclosure, making soft, whimpering sounds that carried through the thin walls. Luna, the stronger of the two, pressed her tiny nose against the glass partition that separated them from the surgical area, as if willing her presence to reach Marcus. Jake regained consciousness around 5 in the morning, the tranquilizer finally wearing off enough for him to focus on his surroundings. His first words were about Marcus, and Sarah had to hold him down when he tried to get up from the gurney. "Easy, soldier," she said gently. "You took a hell of a dose. Your heart stopped twice in the ambulance." "Marcus?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse from the chemical trauma. "The cubs?" Sarah's silence told him everything. Through the observation window, they could see Dr. Yamamoto working frantically while Margaret maintained her vigil. The machines monitoring Marcus's vital signs painted a grim picture of a body that had endured too much for too long. "He's dying, isn't he?" Jake said, the words cutting through the antiseptic air like broken glass. "His body's been running on pure determination for months. Sarah replied, her professional composure cracking slightly. All those old injuries, the malnutrition, the stress, it's finally catching up with him. Dr. Yamamoto says his chances are less than 20%. The irony was devastating. Marcus had survived years of torture, escaped from Vincent's fighting ring, protected 2 orphaned cubs through impossible conditions, and faced down armed men to keep his family safe. Now, in the safety of people who loved him, his body was surrendering to the accumulated damage of a lifetime of abuse. Margaret's voice carried through the intercom system as she continued her one-sided conversation with the unconscious bear. "You know, Marcus, I never told you about my grandson Tommy. He was about the age of your cubs when the drunk driver took him from us. Sweet boy, just like your babies. For the longest time, I thought God was punishing me for something." She paused, her hand still moving gently across Marcus's massive head. "But watching you these past few days, seeing how you love those babies even though they're not your blood, well, maybe love isn't about the family you're born into. Maybe it's about the family you choose to protect." Dr. Yamamoto looked up from her monitors, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. "I've done everything I can medically. His body's just tired. Sometimes that's the most honest diagnosis we can give." The words hung in the morning air like a death sentence. Outside, the sun was rising over the Shasta peaks, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink that seemed mockingly beautiful given the tragedy unfolding inside. That's when the miracle happened. Or perhaps it was just the stubbornness of a creature who'd learned that love was worth any price. Marcus's eyes opened. Not the glazed, unfocused look of semi-consciousness, but the clear, intelligent gaze that had captured Sarah's heart from the very beginning. His massive head turned slightly, seeking the source of Margaret's voice, and when their eyes met, something passed between them that transcended species and circumstance. "Well, hello there, big boy," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking with relief and joy. "Decided to stick around after all?" Marcus made a sound, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh, but something that spoke of a decision made and a battle won. His vital signs stabilized slowly, like a car engine warming up on a cold morning. Dr. Yamamoto stared at her monitors in professional disbelief. "I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 22 years, she said quietly, "and I've never seen anything like this. There's no medical explanation for what just happened." But Sarah understood. Marcus hadn't recovered because of their medical intervention. He'd recovered because he'd heard Margaret's story about love transcending blood, about families chosen rather than inherited. He'd realized that dying now would abandon not just Luna and Bear Jr., but also the humans who'd proven themselves worthy of trust. Jake struggled to his feet, still weak from the tranquilizer, but determined to be present for Marcus's awakening. "Hey, big guy," he said softly, approaching the surgical table with the careful respect of one warrior acknowledging another. "You scared us there for a while." Marcus's gaze shifted to Jake, and in those scarred features Sarah saw something she'd never expected. Peace. The constant tension that had defined the bear's every movement since his arrival was gone, replaced by a quiet acceptance that spoke of a creature who'd finally found his place in the world. "Can we bring the cubs in?" Margaret asked, her grandmother's instincts recognizing the importance of the moment. "They need to see him, and he needs to see them." Dr. Yamamoto hesitated, then nodded. "His vitals are stable. And honestly, at this point I think emotional healing might be more important than medical protocol." The reunion was everything Sarah had hoped for, and more devastating than she'd feared. Luna and Bear Jr. approached Marcus's prone form with the careful uncertainty of children who'd learned that the adults they loved could disappear without warning. But when Marcus lifted his massive head and gently nuzzled each cub, The relief in the room was palpable. Bear Jr., the smaller and more fragile of the two, climbed carefully onto Marcus's chest, settling into the familiar hollow just below his shoulder where he'd found safety during their darkest days. Luna curled up against his side, her tiny paws kneading the thick fur as she purred with contentment. "There's your family," Margaret said softly, tears of joy replacing the tears of grief she'd been shedding. All safe, all together, all loved. But even as they celebrated Marcus's recovery, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on them like gathering storm clouds. Vincent's arrest had exposed the extent of the illegal animal trafficking network, but it had also revealed the dangerous enemies they'd made. Federal prosecutors warned that Vincent's associates would likely target the Wildlife Center for harboring key evidence. More immediately, the financial crisis remained unsolved. The community fundraising had been generous but insufficient, raising only $38,000 against the $200,000 debt. The bank had agreed to a temporary extension given the federal investigation, but foreclosure loomed like a sword hanging over everything they'd built. "We'll figure something out," Sarah said, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "We always do." Margaret squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "Some battles you win with bullets, honey. Others you win with love. We've got plenty of both." As the morning sun climbed higher over the mountains, Marcus closed his eyes again, not in unconsciousness this time, but in the peaceful sleep of a guardian who'd finally found safety for his charges. Luna and Bear Jr. slept curled against him, their breathing synchronized with his massive chest. But even as the immediate crisis passed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their trials were far from over. Vincent's arrest was just the beginning, and the forces they'd challenged had resources and connections that stretched far beyond one man's criminal enterprise. The real test of their chosen family's strength was yet to come. The revelation came at 3 in the afternoon, delivered by FBI agent Rebecca Martinez in a voice that carried the weight of 15 years of buried truth. Sarah sat in her father's old office, surrounded by the wildlife photographs and military commendations that had defined her understanding of the man who'd raised her, while Agent Martinez systematically destroyed every assumption she'd ever made about his death. "Your father wasn't just investigating Vincent's operation," Agent Martinez explained, spreading classified documents across the desk with careful precision. "He was our primary undercover asset inside the entire network. Colonel James Riverwind spent 3 years infiltrating animal trafficking organizations across the western United States, gathering evidence that we're still using to prosecute cases today." Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up surveillance photographs showing her father in meetings with men she recognized from Vincent's criminal enterprise. In the images, he looked older than she remembered, worn down by the weight of secrets and the constant danger of discovery. "He knew they were getting suspicious," Agent Martinez continued. "His last report mentioned plans to extract him from the operation, but Vincent moved faster than we anticipated. The heart attack was induced, an untraceable compound injected during what appeared to be a routine medical examination." Margaret, who'd insisted on being present for the briefing, made a sound like a wounded animal. That poor man. Carrying all that darkness, protecting everyone else from the truth. No wonder he seemed so tired those last few months. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Agent Martinez pulled out a thick folder marked with Sarah's father's name and placed it gently on the desk. "There's something else. Something that changes everything about this current situation." Inside the folder were documents Sarah had never seen before, transfer papers, financial records, and a last will and testament that had been sealed under federal witness protection protocols. Her father hadn't just been investigating Vincent's network. He'd been systematically dismantling it from within, using his military connections to seize assets and redirect funds to legitimate wildlife conservation efforts. "The land this rehabilitation center sits on," Agent Martinez said quietly. "Your father purchased it using money seized from Vincent's operations. The building funds, the initial equipment, even your veterinary school tuition, it all came from his undercover work. He was using their own profits to build something that would protect the animals they were destroying." Sarah felt the world tilt around her as the implications sank in. Everything she'd built, everything she'd accomplished, had been funded by her father's dangerous game with the very criminals who'd eventually killed him. The Wildlife Center wasn't just her life's work. It was his final operation, a lasting victory over the forces of cruelty and exploitation. "There's more," Agent Martinez said, producing a sealed envelope with Sarah's name written in her father's familiar handwriting. He left instructions that this was only to be delivered if Vincent's network ever discovered the center's true purpose. Sarah's fingers shook as she opened the envelope, recognizing her father's careful script even after 15 years. The letter was brief but devastating. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then the monsters I've been fighting have found you. I'm sorry for the secrets, sorry for the danger I've brought to your door, but never sorry for the choice to protect the innocent." The center is more than a rehabilitation facility. It's a fortress against cruelty, built with the profits of evil and transformed into something good. Vincent and his people will try to destroy it, not just for revenge, but because it represents everything they fear. Proof that love can triumph over profit, that beauty can grow from ashes. Fight them, daughter. Fight them with everything I taught you, everything your mother gave you, everything this place represents. The account numbers at the bottom of this page contain enough money to keep the center running for 50 years. It's all yours now, my final gift, and my promise that good will always find a way to win. Love, Dad. The account numbers led to offshore holdings that Sarah's father had been quietly building for over a decade, using seized criminal assets and careful investments to create an endowment that dwarfed their current financial troubles. $2.5 million, protected by federal banking laws and waiting for the day his daughter would need it most. Margaret read the letter over Sarah's shoulder, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "That man planned for everything," she whispered. "Even his own death couldn't stop him from protecting you." But Agent Martinez's expression remained grave. "There's a catch," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "Accessing those funds requires formal testimony in federal court about Vincent's operations. Sarah would have to reveal everything: her father's undercover work, the center's connection to the criminal network, even Marcus's role as evidence in the case." The implications were staggering. Testifying would save the center financially but expose them to retaliation from Vincent's remaining associates. Worse, it would transform Marcus and the cubs from rescued animals into federal evidence, potentially requiring their relocation to a secure facility for their own protection. Jake, who'd been listening from his wheelchair in the corner, spoke up for the first time. "What happens to Marcus and the cubs if Sarah testifies?" Agent Martinez's hesitation told them everything they needed to know. Federal witness protection protocols would require relocating all key evidence to secure facilities. The bears would be transferred to a government-operated sanctuary in Montana, away from potential threats. "Separated?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp with alarm. "The adult male would go to a high-security facility designed for dangerous animals. The cubs would be placed in a breeding program to preserve their genetic line." Sarah felt her heart shatter. After everything Marcus had endured, everything he'd sacrificed to keep his family together, the government wanted to tear them apart in the name of their protection. The money that could save the center would destroy the very family that had made it worth saving. "How long do we have to decide?" Sarah asked. though she already knew the answer would be insufficient. "Vincent's arraignment is tomorrow morning. If you're going to testify, we need your decision tonight." The afternoon stretched into evening as Sarah wrestled with the impossible choice her father had unknowingly left her: save the center and destroy Marcus's family, or preserve their bond and watch everything collapse under financial pressure. Every option felt like a betrayal of someone she loved. Marcus seemed to sense the tension rippling through his human family. The massive bear remained alert in his enclosure, his scarred face constantly turning toward the main building where heated discussions continued late into the night. Luna and Bear Jr. stayed pressed against his sides, as if sensing that their safety hung in the balance of human decisions they couldn't understand. "He knows," Jake observed during one of his visits to the enclosure. "Look at his eyes. He knows something's wrong." Margaret had taken up permanent residence in the folding chair beside Marcus's fence, her presence a constant source of comfort for both the bear and the humans struggling with their choice. "You know what your daddy would say," she told Sarah as midnight approached. "He'd say the choice that feels impossible is usually the choice that matters most." But it was Marcus himself who provided the answer in a moment of clarity that transcended species and circumstance. As Sarah knelt beside his enclosure, explaining through tears that testifying might mean separation, the scarred bear did something extraordinary. He gently picked up a stick in his massive jaws and pushed it through the fence toward her, the same behavior he'd used to offer food to his cubs when they were too weak to eat. "He's trying to take care of you," Margaret realized, her voice filled with wonder. "Even now he's trying to protect his family." Sarah understood then what her father had really been trying to tell her in his final letter. The choice wasn't between money and love, or safety and sacrifice. The choice was between fear and faith. Faith that love could find a way to survive even the worst circumstances. Faith that good people would fight for what mattered most. "Agent Martinez," Sarah said, her voice steady with newfound resolve. "I'll testify. But I have conditions." The negotiation that followed stretched through the night, involving federal prosecutors, wildlife protection advocates, and tribal council representatives who claimed jurisdiction over Marcus as a sacred animal. When dawn broke over the Shasta Mountains, they had reached an unprecedented agreement that would change wildlife protection law forever. Marcus and his cubs would remain together at the center, now officially designated as a federal wildlife sanctuary under Sarah's directorship. The facility would receive permanent funding and federal protection, becoming a model for rehabilitation programs across the country. Vincent's conviction would help dismantle the entire trafficking network, saving countless animals from the suffering Marcus had endured. But the victory came with its own burden. Sarah would spend the next months testifying in trials across the country, reliving her father's sacrifice and Marcus's trauma in courtroom after courtroom. The center would be under constant federal surveillance, their peaceful mountain sanctuary transformed into a fortress against the forces of cruelty. As Sarah prepared for the legal battle ahead, she found Marcus watching her with those intelligent eyes that had seen too much suffering but somehow still held hope. In that gaze, she saw her father's legacy and her own future intertwined, a promise that love could triumph over profit, that healing could grow from the deepest wounds. The war against cruelty was far from over, but they'd won a battle that mattered. 1 year later, the Shasta Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had transformed into something Sarah's father could never have imagined when he first purchased the land with money seized from criminals. The federal designation as a protected sanctuary had brought resources beyond their wildest dreams: state-of-the-art medical facilities, expanded enclosures that mimicked natural habitats, and a staff of dedicated professionals who understood that healing required more than just veterinary care. But the most remarkable transformation was in Marcus himself. The scarred bear who'd arrived dying and traumatized had evolved into something unprecedented in wildlife rehabilitation. a foster father whose gentle guidance helped dozens of orphaned cubs learn to trust again. His enclosure had been expanded into a multi-acre habitat where Luna and Bear Jr., now healthy juveniles, taught newcomers the skills they'd need to survive in the wild. Sarah stood at the observation deck, watching Marcus demonstrate fishing techniques to a group of rescued cubs in the artificial stream that wound through his territory. His patience was infinite, his protective instincts now channeled into nurturing rather than defending. The federal prosecutors had been amazed to discover that Marcus's unique background made him the perfect ambassador for traumatized animals. He understood their fear because he'd lived it, and his recovery gave them hope. "Dr. Riverwind, you have visitors," announced Jessica Chen, the young veterinarian who'd joined the staff after graduating from UC Davis. Her excitement was barely contained as she gestured toward the parking area, where a familiar figure was climbing out of a government sedan. Agent Martinez approached with a smile that Sarah had rarely seen during the difficult months of testimony and trials. Behind her walked a man Sarah recognized from newspaper photos, Vincent Stormcloud, but somehow diminished, his expensive suits replaced by prison-issued clothing, and his predatory confidence replaced by something that looked remarkably like humility. "Dr. Riverwind," Agent Martinez began, "I wanted you to hear this directly from Mr. Stormcloud. Vincent, tell her what you told the parole board." Vincent's voice was different, quieter, stripped of the calculated menace Sarah remembered. "I've been watching the webcam feeds from your sanctuary," he said, his eyes focused on the ground rather than meeting her gaze. "Seeing what Marcus has become, how he's helping other animals heal, it made me realize what I'd destroyed with my own hands." Sarah felt Margaret's presence beside her, the elderly woman's wisdom still her anchor in moments of uncertainty. At 74, Margaret had become the sanctuary's unofficial grandmother, her rocking chair in the visitor center a gathering place for families from around the world who came to witness Marcus's story. "What are you saying, Vincent?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral despite the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. "I'm saying I want to make amends," Vincent replied, finally looking up to meet her eyes. "The parole board is allowing me to work here as a volunteer under supervision. I know about animal behavior, about training and rehabilitation. I want to use that knowledge to help instead of harm." The proposal was staggering in its audacity. Vincent Stormcloud, the man who'd tortured Marcus and countless other animals, wanted to work alongside his victims in their healing. Sarah's first instinct was immediate, visceral rejection. But Margaret's gentle hand on her arm reminded her of the forgiveness that had become central to the sanctuary's mission. "Marcus would have to approve," Sarah said finally. "If he shows any distress at your presence, you leave immediately and never come back." The meeting between Marcus and his former tormentor was arranged with careful protocols and emergency procedures in place. Vincent approached the enclosure accompanied by Sarah, Agent Martinez, and a team of behavioral specialists who monitored every nuance of the interaction. Marcus recognized Vincent immediately. His massive frame tensed, and for a moment Sarah feared they'd see the return of the traumatized bear who'd first arrived at the sanctuary. But instead of aggression or fear, Marcus did something extraordinary. He moved protectively in front of Luna and Bear Jr., then sat down and simply watched Vincent with those intelligent eyes that had seen the worst of humanity and somehow found the strength to hope for better. "He remembers," Vincent whispered, tears streaming down his face as he knelt beside the fence. "God help me, he remembers everything I did to him and he's not afraid anymore." The transformation that followed was gradual but profound. Vincent's knowledge of animal psychology, gained through years of exploitation, proved invaluable when applied to healing rather than harming. He developed new techniques for helping traumatized animals overcome their fear of humans, drawing on his understanding of how trust could be broken to learn how it might be rebuilt. Jake, now the sanctuary's head of security and photography, documented Vincent's rehabilitation with the same careful attention he'd once given to war zones. The images of Marcus's former abuser cleaning enclosures, preparing food, and gently treating injured animals became powerful testimony to the possibility of redemption. Margaret, in her wisdom, saw the deeper truth. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, she told visitors who questioned Vincent's presence. It's about choosing love over hate, healing over revenge. Marcus understands that better than any of us. The sanctuary's success had attracted international attention, with wildlife rehabilitation centers from around the world sending staff to study their methods. The combination of cutting-edge veterinary care, trauma-informed animal psychology, and the unique healing presence of Marcus himself had created something unprecedented in conservation work. Sarah often found herself in her father's old office, now expanded into a research center where teams of scientists studied the intersection of animal psychology and human healing. Veterans with PTSD worked alongside rescued animals, their shared understanding of trauma creating bonds that transcended species. Elderly volunteers like Margaret found new purpose in nurturing creatures that society had written off as damaged beyond repair. The financial security provided by her father's hidden endowment had allowed the sanctuary to become fully self-sustaining, with educational programs, research grants, and carefully managed tourism providing ongoing revenue. But more importantly, it had become a living testament to the principle that love could triumph over the darkest cruelty. On quiet evenings, Sarah would watch Marcus playing with the latest group of rescued cubs, his scarred face gentle with paternal pride as Luna and Bear Jr. helped teach newcomers the skills they'd need to survive. The circle of healing expanded with each new arrival, each successful rehabilitation, each moment when fear gave way to trust. The last entry in her father's hidden journal, discovered months after his financial records, had become the sanctuary's unofficial motto. The measure of our humanity isn't in our capacity for cruelty, but in our willingness to heal what we've broken. Marcus had proven that even the deepest wounds could become sources of strength, that the most broken among them could become the greatest healers. In choosing love over fear, forgiveness over revenge, they'd created something that would outlast them all, a place where second chances weren't just possible but inevitable. Dear friends, Marcus's story isn't just about a scarred bear who chose love over fear. It's about all of us who've carried wounds we thought would never heal. Like many of you who've weathered decades of life's storms, Marcus discovered that our deepest pain can become our greatest gift to others. At 73, Margaret found her purpose wasn't behind her, but ahead of her, nurturing creatures society had written off as beyond saving. Jake learned that the nightmares from Afghanistan could transform into wisdom that helped heal traumatized animals. Sarah realized her father's sacrifice wasn't an ending, but a beginning, creating ripples of hope that would outlast them all. How many times have we felt invisible, forgotten, or believed our best years were behind us? Marcus reminds us that it's never too late to become someone's protector, someone's safe harbor. Your experience, your scars, your hard-won wisdom aren't burdens. They're exactly what this broken world needs. Every grandchild who rarely calls, every friend lost to illness, every moment you've felt overlooked has prepared you for this. To be the gentle giant who shows others that love always finds a way. Your story isn't over. It's just getting to the good part. What wound in your life has become your greatest source of compassion for others? Have you ever felt written off by society only to discover your true purpose was still waiting to be found? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.